So I will note that Reverend Liz was rather adamant that she not preach on her last Sunday with us. So that is why I am in the pulpit this morning. And when I read the words of the psalmist, I felt drawn to the idea of offering a meditation on ministry. So this is that in three parts: the ministry of death, the ministry of life together, the ministry of unexpected gifts and presents. I will also tell you before I really jump in that I told Liz and Josh I would only preach for 5 to 8 minutes, and then I started writing, so we'll be here a little bit longer than that. As many of you know, on Wednesday, my family and I laid my grandfather to rest in our family cemetery back in Tennessee. And during his funeral, one of the most common refrains of his remembrance came from people recounting how he prayed. I think that he epitomized the words of the psalmist, "Happy are the people who know the festal shout, who walk, O Lord, in the light of your countenance." As we left the funeral home, a line of some 50 cars escorted by the sheriff's department drove 7 miles through downtown Greenville, out into the country, then up the gravel path to our church. At one intersection, a man stood outside with his hand across his heart. Now, I don't actually think he knew my grandfather or who was in the funeral procession, but I also don't think that actually matters, because what the man saw was the reality of life and death. This was, I believe, part of the ministry of death, a ministry that we don't really like to talk about while we are living. But even so, it presents an opportunity to bear witness to the idea that this earthly life is not the end. I believe that the ways that we acknowledge death are part of the tapestry that shapes one's final act of ministry on this side of heaven. And of course, thinking about all of that made me think about the idea of the priesthood of all believers. The idea that there is no distinction between those who stand up in this place and those who sit there in that place, and our ability to engage in the work of discerning, knowing, and interpreting the call and will of God. This particular theological bedrock makes space, I believe, for our common life and lot together. It also makes room for our ability to live out the phrase that first appeared in the 1500s: in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, diversity; and in all things, charity. In our common ministry, our life together, we join our hearts and hands in worship. We sing hymns together. We expand the horizon of what we know and what we think we know in Sunday school. We host luncheons and brunches. We bring a dish to the potluck. We hide and hunt Easter eggs. We send birthday cards, visit folks in the hospital, update one another on our health and other needs. And yes, we make boards and committees to guide and support the common life and ministry of the church. We are good about naming what we do, but it's really hard about naming why we do it. We struggle with that, particularly, I think, as folks who often call themselves progressive Christians. Some of the older language of our faith feels a little bit harmful and stuffy for us to use. But I think that in our psalm today, there's some easy, tailor-made language for all of us to grasp onto. Yes, in sharing a life together and sharing a common lot in life and ministry, we too sing of God's steadfast love. We too proclaim God's faithfulness to all generations. And it's in this faithfulness where we often find or meet unexpected gifts, unexpected grace, and unexpected presence too. I have joked before that every single church says the same thing about what kind of pastors they want. Someone who can preach well, can show compassion and empathy, is funny, and doesn't take themselves too seriously. I promise you, every single church says they want those exact 4 things. There's a lot more nuance, though, that takes place in the conversation among pastoral search committees. The church world is interesting, I think, because a lot of the search and call process looks like the corporate world. What's on your resume? Where did you go to school? How long have you been doing the work that you've been called to do, and with the credentials that say that you can do it? And we decide a lot based upon that paper introduction. After a bit more conversation, the candidate and a search committee believe that they know just enough about each other that they can move forward in the process. In our tradition, the call of clergy and congregation to journey together is made real by a formal vote and sharing of covenant. This is not an unremarkable thing. It is a particular way of engaging in the Christian life, to say we believe that we've been called to journey together for such a time as this. Now, I imagine if you polled congregations on what they thought they'd receive from a minister when they called them, versus what they actually received when that minister departed, you might find a fair number of wonderful surprises and things that were left unexpected. That is part of the call process that can't be determined by resume or by watching sermons on tape or on live stream. It's something determined by simply getting to know the person and the congregation together. You begin to form a common lot, a common life, and share in a common ministry as one. Last week, Reverend Liz told you that ministers really only have one sermon. And I'm not quite sure that's right. I think that Reverend Liz has at least two sermons. The first she identified as highlighting and encouraging people to engage in the great ever-unfolding conversation to figure out what it is and how it is that we might respond to God's call in the world. The second sermon, I think, is actually found here in our psalm today, in verse 16. They exult in your name all day long and extol your righteousness. My hunch is that if I polled you in May of 2024, you wouldn't have guessed you'd receive a minister who really illustrates that verse of the 89th Psalm. But I also imagine if I polled you right now, you would say, yeah, that sounds right. Yes, this is a meditation on ministry. In addition to the obvious talents and gifts that every person brings to the life of this people of God, there are other intangible things that we don't quite recognize until our journey together comes to an end. And Reverend Liz, what I have heard from many of you over the past 2 years, something along these lines. She just radiates the love of God. She demonstrates an intense zeal for extravagant welcome. She's just herself, unlike any other senior minister I've ever had, and I am so glad that is the case. None of that is really on a resume. None of that really comes through in interviews. None of that really comes through when you watch the sermons that ministers often self-select for folks to review. No, what I described just now are the intangible qualities, gifts, and types of presence that are found only through sharing and engaging in a common life and ministry together. They're the kinds of gifts that people share in a space like this when they commit themselves to singing of God's steadfast love, commit themselves to proclaiming God's faithfulness to all generations. The reality of ministry in the United Church of Christ is interesting. More often than not, our journeys as minister and congregation come to an end not because of something bad, but rather because we've simply completed the call that we were meant to share. This is a short history of ministers in this congregation and gifts they left behind in addition to their preaching and their ministry alongside you. In Reverend David Witherspoon Dodge, Central received the gift of theological liberalism back in the 1920s. And Dr. Tom Anderson, the gift of forming an identity that this might be a house and taking seriously the idea of being and becoming a flagship church for Congregationalism in the American South. Reverend Fred Meyer found ways to encourage the congregation to identify their own gifts and then share them in leading and guiding the church. Bill Scott created space for Central to be a leader in nurturing the next generation of clergy. Mary Brueggemann offered the kind of solid, intentional presence needed to heal open and old wounds. Steve Sterner brought the gift of imagination, inviting this congregation to dare to dream of being bigger and more engaged than it already was. Budfriend Jones moved this church to open its doors to a synagogue and a Korean language UCC congregation. Shannon Michael offered the gift of impassioned theological depth. Lacey Brown brought a kind of patient practice calm amid a series of difficult transitions and the onslaught of the COVID pandemic. Scott Cox brought the kind of compassion and quiet presence that most ministers dream and hope they might one day have. Elizabeth Mitchell Clement brought the ability to live so freely and joyfully in the confidence of God's love that you can't help but imagine and accept that that kind of love might exist for and extend to you. Yes, we thank God for pastors and congregations who share themselves with one another, and even in departure, we acknowledge that there is good news. We have been changed. Yes, it's true that God loves us as we are and loves us too much to let us stay that way. So from time to time, God sends us folks that might and who might ruffle some feathers, shake a few trees, challenge our comfort, unearth buried things, see new visions, imagine newer worlds, and help all of us emerge better than once we were. That is a great and wonderful gift of ministry. Gifts that resumes and interviews can't quite pick up, but that we can all find in each other when we decide to hold fast the words of the psalmist that we find in this text today, that we might hold fast to the idea that God's faithfulness indeed extends for generations, speaks to, through, and beyond age, so that all of us might encounter in this time together the still speaking, still calling, still moving, still hard at work God, who looks at each of us, finds us, knows us, calls us to account, not to call us out, but to simply call us in, to share in a more bold, more beautiful, more imaginative, and deeply heartfelt ministry than we have ever shared before. And whether those ministries last for just 2 years or for 20, we encounter in that time together exactly what we happened to need, exactly when we happened to need it. And we trust that in that departure, we might be able to acknowledge and recognize that there will be gifts that continue to unfold and be made known to us even beyond our time here in this hour. That years from now, you might look back and say, oh my gosh, when Reverend Liz said this thing about ensuring that we might all participate in giving money to our parish fund, that's because she had this idea that we might all truly participate in the common life and ministry of this church, that we wouldn't receive a gift and then say, we're good to go, but instead say, we've received a gift, and how do we ensure that all of us can participate in being a part of sharing and giving to that gift all the same? Yes, this is a meditation on ministry. This is a gift of ministry, something that was offered to us by a God who knows us more deeply than we might ever know ourselves, who can see what's happening in the midst of our congregation, in the midst of our common life brought here together, and say, this is who you're supposed to have for such a time as this. May you be open in all the ways that you can, in as many ways as you can, as often as you can, so that you might meet each other exactly where you are and be changed. Yes, thank God for the gift of ministers who have the courage, the wisdom, and the grace to accept the call they've been given, enter into places that sometimes might make them uncomfortable, work with colleagues that might challenge them a bit more than they expected, and yet also still find in this place the ability to push for something to be different than once it was. Thank God for the ability to see and understand new gifts, to accept the gift and ministry of presence, to accept folks exactly as they are, receiving exactly what they have to offer, again, hoping that we might simply be transformed, changed, made more whole and more complete in our journey of this Christian life together. Yes, praise be to God for their faithfulness to all generations, for offering us pastors and teachers, siblings and friends for this long and difficult journey, made easier by gifts of compassion, gifts of grace, gifts of mercy, and yes, indeed, gifts of love. Thanks be to God for their faithfulness to all generations. Thanks be to God for Reverend Liz. Amen.